Welcome to AccuWeather's Ask the Experts. I'm your host, Jeff Cornish. We go beyond the forecast and give you the how and why on all the cool and interesting things you've wondered about and wanted to ask in weather, space, and science. And today we're exploring the ways and always interesting intersection between weather and sports. Lots of impacts in this crossover and diving into what some consider one of the greatest and coldest professional football games of all time, the Ice Bowl of 1967. And joining us now is a man who has spent a lot of time dissecting all of the interesting stories of that amazing game and the weather that surrounded it. We have the book here, The Ice Bowl, written by Ed Groover, award-winning sports writer and author of several sports books, including this very book, The Ice Bowl, The Cold Truth About Football's Most Unforgettable Game, to Ask the Experts. So Ed, thanks so much for making time for us.
Well, thanks, Jeff, for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, it's great talking sports and weather and the crossover here on the AccuWeather Network. It's something that we love to dig into. And this is a legendary event that you have written about. So as a sports fan and someone with a passion for the weather, it's always interesting to see how the weather can play a role in sports, especially football, more than most others, and even beyond the gridiron. Certainly, you've covered everything from baseball to hockey. It seems to me there was obvious interest in writing about the game here with the brutal weather and the importance of the game. You were only 7 years old at the time the game was played. Was there another reason you wanted to look at this more closely?
Yeah, actually, my older brother, Mike, was a big Packers fan in the mid-'60s. Even though we grew up in North Jersey, just outside New York City, the Packers in the Lombardi era were the team that was featured the most on national television. And he became a Packers fan. And he was watching the game, and he called me into the living room where the TV was on, and he said, "Hey, Ed, you got to see this." And, I went in there, and it was the first pro football game that I ever watched from start to finish. And, like I've said many times, it was a great one to grow up on because it's arguably the greatest NFL game ever played.
That's great. That's fantastic. As a fan from home, from the comfort of home, the worse the weather is, the more interesting it is to watch sometimes. But there was a lot going on with this particular game, obviously, beyond that. So before we get into the amazing cold and the weather stories of this game, this was a significant game in football history for many reasons. So how important was this game in terms of the building blocks of what we now know to be the National Football League?
It was very important for a lot of reasons. Number one, the Lombardi Packers had won the previous two NFL championships and the first Super Bowl in January of '67 when they beat the AFL champion Kansas City Chiefs. And Lombardi was going for an unprecedented third NFL championship. And he was going against the Cowboys and going against a former colleague, Tom Landry, who was head coach of the Cowboys, and they had coached together on the great New York Giants teams of the mid and late 1950s and had won an NFL championship together in 1956 with the Giants. So things kind of came full circle for Lombardi and Landry in this game. They had met the year before in the NFL championship game to decide who would go to the first Super Bowl, who would represent the NFL. And that game was played in Dallas in the Cotton Bowl. The Packers won, but it was very close. They only won by a touchdown. So they rematched for this game in Green Bay, in Lambeau Field. And again, Lombardi had intimated to many in his circle that, win or lose, this was probably going to be his final year in Green Bay. And so there was a lot riding on this game.
And how fearful were the officials and players of the impending cold? And were some of those fears mitigated by a system that Green Bay had installed to keep the field maybe a little warmer or thawed in some form? I understand there's a system used to run warmer water under the field, supposed to keep the field from freezing. How'd that work out?
Yeah, actually, it worked out well on the surface. Lombardi had installed an electric grid beneath Lambeau Field for just this purpose. And the interesting thing was that the day before the game and in the days leading up to the game, the weather in Green Bay was relatively warm, at least for that part of the country. The Cowboys were very happy with the weather on Saturday, the eve of the game. And they said, if it's going to be like this tomorrow, this is going to be great because the Cowboys are a team built on speed. They were younger than the Packers, and they felt like, they had almost beaten Green Bay the year before. and that if the weather cooperated, they would be able to beat them this time around and go to the Super Bowl. What happened was that you had this Canadian cold front that came in overnight and basically froze Green Bay. And but Lombardi's electric grid was working. It was heating the fields, keeping it moist, but the cold was so intense that when they removed the tarpaulin prior to the game, the field flash froze. So that's why you had this slick, icy surface, and basically it turned the Lambeau Field into a skating rink.
Pretty incredible. We're going to talk a little bit more in detail about the playing conditions and how bad they were in our next segment, but there was speculation that field warming system either broke in the cold weather or was turned off by Green Bay for a competitive advantage. You know, people talk and sometimes there's some myth. Is there any truth to that?
No, none at all. I know some of the Cowboys have told me through the years that, it's kind of tongue in cheek that, yeah, we think Lombardi, turned off his system, the morning of the game, but they knew Lombardi, and they knew that it was completely foreign to him to try to win a game by cheating. I mean, if he had to do that, he would rather lose a game than win by cheating. So there's no truth whatsoever to this conspiracy theory, so to speak, that Lombardi turned off his electric heating system. And the Cowboys themselves have told me many times that, they're basically just joking when they say that they knew what kind of man Lombardi was, the principles that he had, and that he would never resort to cheating to try to win a game.
Okay. Well, Ed, this does lead us to our first viewer question, which was sent in about the game from Tyler in Indiana. And Tyler writes, if the field was in such bad shape and temperatures were that brutal, why not postpone the game a day or two? You and I talked about a Buffalo game recently being pushed back, playoff game because of lake effect snow. The society's a little different now compared to a few decades ago. So why did they not postpone the game?
Well, the interesting thing about this game is that Pete Rozelle, who was the commissioner of the NFL, normally would have been in Green Bay for the game. But the two leagues, the NFL and the AFL, had recently merged. And Rozelle, trying to show partiality to the AFL, actually flew to Oakland, where the Raiders were hosting the Houston Oilers in the AFL championship game that same afternoon. So he was not in Green Bay for the Ice Bowl. He was in Oakland. He was getting hour-by-hour reports about the field conditions and the weather. And basically, it was his call. He left it up to the officials and the coaches to decide. And they said, let's just go ahead and play the game. It's going to be the same for both sides. We don't really feel that either team is going to have an advantage. So let's just play the game, in the existing conditions.
And Ed, you've been covering sports journalism and working as a sports journalist for many years. Do you think that in popular conversation, maybe the climate where a team comes from is overstated as influential? Say Miami's going to be playing Minnesota or maybe Green Bay, and they're outside at Lambeau again. Obviously, the athletes, they're drafted and they're signed from all over the country, all over the world in some cases. Mm-hmm. So they're not all coming, they didn't grow up in Miami and Dade County. Do you think that we generally overstate the influence, or is there a significant parallel there between where you regularly train and practice and playing in a different climate?
I think there is a parallel, but I think also it can be overstated. Like you said, players are drafted from all parts of the country. They played high school ball in one part of the country, college ball. So if they're suddenly going to a professional team in another part of the country, it's not like they haven't been to that area before, or they don't know how to play in heat or cold conditions.
And just briefly, Ed, were there any other stories about fans who were attending this game or journalists in the press box that maybe even the grounds crew that faced some really difficult conditions? Any legendary stories peripheral to what actually happened on the field in preparation for or during this game?
Yeah, many stories, in fact. And, I did after the book was published, I did a book tour, went to Green Bay, went to various parts of Wisconsin. And I don't know how many people I ran into who said, "Oh yeah, I was at that game," And it would have been nice if they were at the game to have interviewed them prior, because they did have some great stories to tell. People covered, the sports writers covering the game had a hard time, looking through the glass of the press box because it was frozen over. They couldn't really see the field that well or the plays. The officials, it's the only game in NFL history where the officials didn't use whistles. They tried to use the whistle at the kickoff, the opening kickoff, and the one official, half of his lower lip got frozen to the whistle and kind of pulled the skin off. So they decided from that point on, no whistles. We're just going to tell them, hey, the play's over. Everybody, up, back to the huddles. There were a lot of things going on that day, certainly on the periphery that affected everybody involved, and not only the players.
Fascinating. Coming up here and after the break, Ed will return to break down some of the specifics of the game itself as we continue talking about the December 1967 Ice Bowl. Coming up later, the Ice Bowl was not the only frigid football game in history. In our Weather-Wise segment, we're going to reveal some of the other top 3 coldest playoff games when Ask the Experts returns. Welcome back to AccuWeather's Ask the Experts. I'm your host, Jeff Cornish, and we're back with award-winning sports writer and journalist Ed Groover. He is the author of the book, The Ice Bowl, The Cold Truth About Football's Most Unforgettable Game. Ed, thanks again for being with us here. Love talking to you about how the weather influenced this spectacular game in the earlier days of the NFL. In this first segment, we talked about the lead up to the game, and now we want to focus on some of the details of the actual game. One amazing story centered on the marching band that was supposed to provide some entertainment that day, but it was so cold, the marching band didn't even get through their pregame practice. Is that right?
Yes, that's true. They took the field, began trying to play their instruments, at least in the cold weather. But, when they put the instruments up to their lips, they froze there. And when they tried to pull them off, some skin went with them. So, they decided at that point, the cold is too intense. We just can't do this today. So it's probably one of the few games in NFL history that doesn't have, a pregame show or a halftime show either.
Pretty wild. And Ed, can you just give us a brief synopsis of how the game played with that cold and who ended up on top?
Yeah. Green Bay took a quick 14-0 lead. They scored 2 touchdowns on 2 Bart Starr passes, and it looked like they were going to, possibly win by a big margin. But Dallas rallied. They cut their deficit to 14-10 at halftime. And then in the third quarter, took the lead 17-14 on a surprise play. In fact, it was a play that was in the Lombardi playbook, a halfback option pass that Lombardi always favored. And so the Cowboys kind of used it against them, scored a touchdown off it, went ahead 17-14. And then it was left up to the Packers with roughly 5 minutes left to have to drive the 68 yards. In the intense cold and on a frozen field and against a great Dallas defense that was known as Doomsday. And, they had to score a touchdown at that point, the Packers, to win. They couldn't, a field goal would have done them, not much good. I mean, they could have tied it and sent it into overtime, but, they were looking to win it in regulation. And, Bart Starr marched them down the field. And then with just 13 seconds remaining on a third down and, one from basically just outside the goal line, Bart called an unorthodox for him and for the Packers, a quarterback sneak. And he followed his right guard, Jerry Kramer, into the end zone in one of the most iconic plays in pro football history.
And you said this was the first complete football game you ever watched with your older brother, Michael, yeah. and he's the one who you dedicated the book to. The players were playing in this dangerous cold the whole way through. Were there any injuries suffered by players or fans due to the exposure to the extreme cold?
Yeah, unfortunately, one gentleman did die in the stands that day. The players themselves, numerous players suffered frostbite. Players on both sides had all kinds of, cold-related injuries. Some of the players through the years told me that, their lungs actually were burned. They had doctors tell them that their lungs were burned from breathing the intense cold for the 3 hours that they were out there that day. Because, as the sun dropped, so did the temperature. And there's estimations that, by the fourth quarter, the actual cold in Green Bay that day was -50 with the wind chill factor. So it is the coldest game in NFL history. And it's also one of the greatest games in NFL history because of what the players on both sides, and there were a lot of Hall of Fame players, a lot of Hall of Fame coaches, and they really rose to the occasion and played a tremendous game.
And Ed, society has changed a lot since 1967. One thing that kind of strikes me is about player safety and the consideration for that. There's a lot of concern these days about player safety. Was that much of an emphasis back then? And compared to now, when we have extreme heat or extreme cold like that Kansas City or Buffalo game that we talked about in recent history of the playoffs?
Yeah, player safety now is a much greater concern than it was back then. And I think if that game was in today's situation, under today's rules, they would have postponed it probably a day like they have for other recent games because of the intense cold and because not only the welfare of the players and the coaches, but also the welfare of the fans. They wouldn't want to subject fans to, those kind of intense conditions. And in fact, Lombardi said after the game, yeah, I could have gone for a game-tying field goal, but, I didn't want the fans to suffer any more torture than they already had. So we were going to go for the touchdown to win it.
Very interesting. Ed, we have time for one more viewer question. This comes from Jen in Missouri. And Jen writes, any interest in a follow-up book on other bad weather games, maybe from another game in recent history?
There are other games out there that have been played in bad weather, but what makes this game so unique is that not only was it played in such interesting and unprecedented weather, but the players themselves, the kind of game they played, the number of Hall of Famers on both sides, it's really a game that stands out as unique. And I can't really think of another game. In fact, there is no other game in pro football history that has all the elements that the Ice Bowl did.
All right, well, there you go. Award-winning sports writer and author of The Ice Bowl, The Cold Truth About Football's Most Unforgettable Game, Ed Groover. Ed, thank you so much for sharing some time with us and some of the lore about this game and the historical significance in the NFL history as well. Thanks again, Ed.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
That was good talking to you. This is good stuff. And don't forget, whenever you have a question about weather, space, or science, you can write us or send us a video question at AskTheExperts@AccuWeather.com. You can also call us at 888-566-6606. And coming up here next, we reveal the other coldest playoff games in football. And we're going to share some interesting stories behind those games. We're going to be right back here on Ask the Experts right after the break, so stay with us. Welcome back to AccuWeather's Ask the Experts. It is now time for Weather-Wise. The Green Bay-Dallas Ice Bowl in 1967 is still the coldest professional football game on record. But we're taking a look at some of the other coldest playoff games in history. We start with what is known as the Freezer Bowl. In 1982, San Diego left sunny California to face Cincinnati. The temperature was 9 degrees below zero at game time with an AccuWeather real feel of 48 degrees below zero. Cincinnati head coach Forrest Gregg had played in the Ice Bowl with Green Bay 15 years earlier. With wind gusts of 35 miles per hour, San Diego's punter said the frozen football felt like kicking a cinder block. Cincinnati won 27-7. The next coldest game happened in 2016. Minnesota hosted Seattle in a wild card matchup that began at 6 degrees below zero with an AccuWeather real feel of 20 below. The game was played outdoors at the University of Minnesota. Both teams struggled to score. Minnesota missed a 27-yard field goal with just 26 seconds remaining. The kick went wide left. Seattle left with a 10-9 victory. And finally, in January of 2024, Miami went to Kansas City with a game-time temperature of 4 degrees below zero with an AccuWeather real field temperature of 27 below. It was so cold, Kansas City quarterback Patrick Mahomes' helmet cracked and 15 fans were treated for frostbite and hypothermia. Kansas City prevailed 26-7. Thanks so much for being with us here on AccuWeather's Ask the Experts. I'm Jeff Cornish. Don't forget, when you have a question about weather, space, or science, you can write us or send us a video question at AskTheExperts@AccuWeather.com. You can also call us at 888-566-6606. Have a great one.